What if I told you there's a man in the mountains of West Virginia whose very existence shouldn't have been possible? A man born from a bloodline that looped inward for generations until fate, poverty, and science all collided in one forgotten house at the end of a dirt road. His name is Timmy Whittaker, and his story is not a rumor, not a legend, but a living record of what happens when isolation becomes inheritance. Tonight, we're taking you inside the world the internet discovered too late. The life behind the headline, the man behind the word asterisk inbred star. Because before the mockery, before the cameras, there was a child born of silence, raised by love, and left behind by everyone else. So as you watch this, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it where you're watching from? Write it down in the comments below. And if stories like this matter to you, stories that pull truth from the shadows, make sure to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. This is not just a story about tragedy or genetics. This is the quiet human history of Timmy Whittaker, the man who carried an entire family's past on his shoulders. The road to Odd, West Virginia, is less a route than a reminder of what America forgets when the maps turn blank. It narrows mile by mile until the asphalt crumbles into dirt, curling through valleys of bare trees and rusted mailboxes that tilt like gravestones. Here, the air smells of wet pine and cold dust, and the silence is deep enough to hear the hum of a single porch light half a mile away. Travelers don't come here by chance. You have to know this road, or someone who once disappeared down it. At its end sits a house that looks older than memory itself. A sagging white structure, roof patched with tin, porch boards gray from decades of rain. Its windows stare out like the eyes of a creature that's learned not to trust daylight. Locals call it the Whitaker place. The name carries weight in Raleigh County, spoken in low tones that hover between disbelief and pity. No one in Odd remembers when the family first arrived, only that they've always been here, tucked away from the rest of town, as if the hills themselves wanted to keep them hidden. The few who've driven this far down the road remember the first sign that they're near. The dogs, a pack of them, always lounging in the yard or following strangers with steady eyes. They're not aggressive, just watchful, part of the unspoken boundary between the Whitakers and everyone else. Behind them, the house leans under the weight of generations who never left it. Paint peels like old skin. A handmade cross sits in the yard, surrounded by children's toys long abandoned and car parts. It looks like life paused here decades ago and never started again. Most people in town avoid the subject entirely. They've heard the rumors that the family's different, that the children don't speak, that their lineage twists inward like vines starved of sunlight. Others insist the Whitakers are harmless, just poor folks living the only life they know. Whichever version you hear, it's clear this is a family the town has chosen not to see. Their mail still comes, but no one lingers long enough to deliver it by hand. The sheriff checks in now and then, mostly to satisfy curiosity, not concern. Inside, lights flicker on and off depending on whether the generator holds. Some nights, voices, or what sound like voices, echo faintly through the thin mountain air. Not words exactly, but tones, calls, the kind of communication that belongs more to instinct than language. The neighbors say they hear them sometimes when the wind carries right. They say it sounds like sorrow. Odd, West Virginia, is not a ghost town. But at the farthest bend of its loneliest road lives a family the world turned ghost long ago. Their house remains upright by habit. Their names carried forward by rumor instead of history. It is here the story begins, not with judgment or spectacle, but with the quiet truth of a place that has spent too long pretending its own people don't exist. In an old Raleigh County marriage ledger, two names appear again and again. Henry Whittaker and John Whittaker. Twin brothers born sometime around the turn of the 20th century. Their signatures mirror each other so closely, it's hard to tell which hand wrote which. Their lives ran parallel, too, same church pews, same stretch of hillside, same stubborn pride that made both men settle within sight of one another's cabins. No one could have imagined that those twin lines of ink would one day loop back upon themselves, folding the family's future into something it could no longer escape. From Henry came a son named Harry. From John, a daughter named Sally. The two grew up together, playing in the same holler, eating from the same garden, breathing the same Appalachian air thick with woods and cold dust. By the time they were grown, There weren't many choices left for courtship in a valley this small. And so Harry married Sally, cousins by blood, nearly siblings by genetics. To the community, it wasn't scandalous. Such pairings happened when families stayed rooted too long in one place. But in biological terms, it was the start of a collapse. Their children inherited more than their parents' last name. They carried paired copies of the same recessive genes, flaws that might have gone unnoticed in unrelated unions, but now sat waiting like traps in their DNA. The next generation took it one step further. Harry and Sally's son, John Whitaker Jr., married Oda Whitaker, his first cousin. By then, the family tree had stopped branching, its limbs bent back inward, circling themselves. The records blur after that, birth certificates half completed, census names misspelled. But by the 1940s, one line stands out. Gracie Whittaker, the child of John and Oda, who would go on to have 15 children of her own, her husband, another John Whittaker, her double first cousin, meaning they shared all 4 grandparents, not just 2. In effect, their children were as genetically close as siblings born of the same parents. With that union, the Whittaker bloodline fully enclosed upon itself. What science later confirmed, the family already knew in their bones, the children of such pairings often struggled. Speech delays, developmental impairments, wandering eyes that didn't align, symptoms not of sin or curse, but of biology run out of room to breathe. The Whittakers were living proof of what textbooks called recessive gene expression and what the locals more simply called bad luck in the blood. By mid-century, the Whittaker name had become its own echo chamber. Marriages outside the kin group were rare, either from habit or from isolation. In that seclusion, one decision compounded another until entire generations carried mirrored DNA, perfect reflections of those twin signatures at the top of the ledger. No curse was cast on this family. It was math. Every repetition narrowed the odds. Every cousin's vow whispered the same promise, that the blood of one house would never thin. In a place where the mountains closed off the horizon, the Whittakers' lineage closed in two, until all that remained was one small family, and the consequences of love drawn too close to home. Mourning in the Whittaker house begins without words. No one calls anyone's name. No good mornings drift through the thin rooms. The first sound is a kettle whistling unevenly on a propane burner, answered by the low grunt of someone rising from a sagging couch. Outside, one of the dogs barks, and from inside comes an echoing bark in reply. Human, playful, perfectly matched in rhythm. It's not mimicry. It's conversation in the only language this house has ever truly known. Laureen moves slowly through the kitchen light. She doesn't speak, but her eyes stay alert, reading the room as others might read a page. A raised eyebrow from her brother Ray is enough to send her reaching for a tin of coffee grounds. He lets out a soft noise, a cross between a hum and a growl, and she slides the mug across to him before he asks. This is how they live. Gestures and sounds woven into a fluent code that outsiders rarely grasp. The table rocks beneath a plate of fried bread. Across from it sits Ray, broad-shouldered, unshaven, his expression distant until the radio flickers on. He answers its static with a short bark of laughter, though nothing funny has been said. He turns toward the window where one of the hounds stands, wagging its tail. The two bark again in sequence, like call and response. For a stranger, it might seem feral, but within these walls, it's as natural as speech. Laureen hums when she's content. The tone rises when she's anxious, falls when she's calm. Betty, still alive then, the family's caretaker, learned to read those sounds the way other people read handwriting. A hum meant hunger. A whimper meant she was cold. Sometimes when the evening settled and the generator stuttered, Betty would hum back just to remind her sister she was heard. The house would fill with soft noises, low rumbles, sighs, the crackle of the wood stove, and it felt almost peaceful, like a lullaby built from broken syllables. Visitors never stayed long. A delivery driver might stop to drop off canned food or an envelope, met by a line of dogs and a chorus of unintelligible sounds from the porch. The driver would nod politely, back away, and tell the next person in town that the Whittakers talked in barks. He wouldn't be wrong, only incomplete, because if you stayed long enough, you'd notice the comprehension beneath the noise. They understood every word spoken to them. When they didn't like what they heard, The air would shift, grunts deepened, heads turned away, and a single sharp bark would end the exchange. At dusk, the house falls quiet, except for the wind through broken screens. The dogs curl under the porch. Inside, Laureen hums to herself. Ray taps the rhythm on the table, and Betty scribbles notes on a scrap of paper only she can read. In their silence lives a strange kind of order, one built not on words, but on the steady pulse of understanding. This house, though worn and forgotten, still speaks in its own language. You just have to listen differently. The light in the Whitaker house that night was dim and trembling. A single bulb swinging from a cord above the iron bed. Rain tapped softly against the tin roof. The kind of rain that muffles sound and turns the world inward. Laureen lay there, her hands clenched at her sides, her breath breaking in short gasps. She couldn't speak, hadn't spoken in years, but her eyes darted toward her sister, Betty, in fear and confusion. Betty squeezed her hand and whispered reassurances, words her sister might not fully understand, but could feel all the same. There were no doctors, no ambulance. The family had seen births before, too many to count. But this one was different. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't spoken of beyond these walls. Months earlier, Laureen's pregnancy had startled the family into silence. She couldn't explain what had happened, only that her behavior had changed, that she'd become withdrawn, afraid of certain footsteps outside the house. No one came forward. No one was held accountable in a place where poverty, disability, and isolation met. The line between neglect and injustice blurred until it vanished entirely. Betty worked through the night, her own hands shaking. She boiled water, tore old sheets into strips, did what women in these hills had done for generations. Laureen's cries grew softer until they were only shallow gasps. When the child came, a boy, small but breathing, the entire room seemed to exhale with him. He didn't cry loudly at first, just a thin whimper, as if testing the air. Betty lifted him, wrapped him in a faded blanket, and placed him against Laureen's chest. For the first time in months, Laureen's expression eased. Her eyes, wide and vacant moments earlier, softened into something that looked like peace. They named him Timmy. The choice was Betty's. It was simple, gentle, the kind of name she thought might belong to a boy unburdened by his past. And no one asked who his father was. They all knew that silence was protection not for the man who caused this, but for the child who would grow up bearing the shadow of his mother's pain. In the days that followed, the family drew closer around Laureen and the baby. Betty took charge of feeding him, cleaning him, keeping him warm near the stove when the cold crept in. Ray, who rarely spoke or showed emotion, hovered near the cradle and grunted softly as if to announce himself as a guardian. The dogs watched too, lying close enough to the door that no stranger could approach unseen. Outsiders whispered when they noticed Laureen's absence from the porch, but the Whitakers gave no answers. Within their walls, the baby's presence brought a fragile light, something to nurture, something pure. The house that once echoed with animal sounds now carried the soft rhythm of a newborn's breathing. No one could erase what had happened, but in this forgotten hollow, the act of caring became its own kind of justice. Timmy's first cries marked not only his arrival, but the beginning of a fragile hope, a life born from harm, yet fiercely claimed by those who refused to let him face the world alone. Each morning, before the dogs stirred, and before the first light touched the hollow, Betty was already moving. She began her day at the wood stove, lighting it with kindling and patience, coaxing warmth into a room that had forgotten what comfort felt like. On the counter sat a chipped bottle of milk, a saucepan, and a cloth. She heated the milk just enough, testing it with her wrist, and carried it to the cradle where Timmy waited. That small act, feeding a child not her own, became the ritual that defined the rest of her life. Laureen would watch from the table, silent, eyes distant, but gentle. She didn't resist when Betty lifted the baby from her arms. Some part of her understood that she could not be what he needed. In that unspoken exchange, a quiet truth settled between the sisters. Betty would take the reins, and Laureen would let her. Betty had already spent years managing the unmanageable siblings with limited speech, a house that demanded repair it would never get, and neighbors who only appeared when pity suited them. She was the one who filled out the paperwork for welfare checks, who haggled at the store when the money came up short, who remembered every doctor's visit for people who couldn't tell the doctor what hurt. Now she added Timmy's small needs to the endless list. She sewed his diapers by hand, made his first toys out of bottle caps and twine, and sang to him in a cracked whisper when the generator failed and the lights went dark. Sometimes Ray would bark from the other room, and Timmy, startled, would whimper. Betty would pat his back and hum low until he quieted again. The noise of the house, grunts, barks, hums, the steady clatter of dishes, became his lullaby. Her own life disappeared quietly beneath the weight of theirs. She never married, though a boy from the next town once tried to court her. "You're always caring for someone," he'd said when she turned him away. She didn't argue. In her mind, love was duty. Family was not something you escaped. It was something you carried until it crushed you, or you learned how to stand under it. As Timmy grew, Betty taught him what she could: how to button a shirt, how to feed the dogs, how to write his name on a scrap of paper. She corrected him softly, proud of every small victory. In him, she saw the faintest hope that maybe the family's story wouldn't end in silence. At night, after everyone was asleep, Betty would sit on the porch with her hands folded in her lap. The hills around her were black, the air still. She'd listen to the faint breathing from inside, the sound of life she alone had kept going. She never called it sacrifice. To her, it was simply the only thing left to do. In a house ruled by poverty and silence, Betty became both voice and spine. The woman who turned survival into an act of love. It began with a single word, soft, uncertain, almost accidental. Betty was rinsing dishes in the tin sink when she heard it, a small, hesitant ****. The sound was so ordinary that at first she thought it came from the radio in the next room. Then she turned and saw Timmy, 2 years old, standing barefoot on the kitchen floor, looking at her with a kind of quiet pride. He said it again, louder this time. ****. The plate slipped from her hand and clattered into the basin. For a moment, the house froze. Laureen, sitting in her usual chair by the window, looked up, startled by the sound that had come from her own child. Ray stopped pacing. Even the dogs went still. The word hung there, fragile as breath, before Betty crossed the room, knelt beside him, and whispered, "Say it again." He did. It wasn't the clarity of speech that moved her. It was the intent. Timmy was trying to reach someone, to shape meaning, something that no one else in the house had ever done. The family had always lived in grunts, hums, and gestures. But here was a child stringing air into purpose. Betty's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. She picked him up and pressed her cheek to his, whispering words he couldn't yet understand, but might someday repeat. After that day, the house began to change in small ways. Betty started teaching him sounds, turning the world into lessons. ***cup, dog, bedstar. Each word was practiced like prayer. She wrote them on scraps of cardboard with a dull pencil, tacked them above the sink and along the hallway, so that learning became part of living. Timmy soaked it in, repeating them with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. His voice was soft and slurred, but it was unmistakably language. Laureen would watch him, eyes following every movement. Sometimes she'd hum low and reach out to touch his hair, as if trying to understand what it felt like to have a child who could speak. And she couldn't say his name, but when he laughed, she'd laugh, too, a sound somewhere between joy and wonder. Ray responded differently. When Timmy spoke, Ray would grunt in rhythm, echoing the cadence like a drum beat. It wasn't mockery. It was participation in the only way he knew. The boy, quick to notice patterns, started imitating Ray's sounds back to him, mixing them with words. A strange language formed, half human, half instinct, but it was communication all the same. Betty kept track of his progress in a notebook. Timmy said dog. Timmy counted to 3. Timmy learned his name. She showed it to no one. In a world that had only ever seen her family as a spectacle or a warning, these pages were proof that something could still grow straight, even from crooked roots. By the time Timmy turned 4, the Whitaker home had a new sound one never heard there before. It was the sound of a child asking for more milk, naming the sky, saying good night. For a family built on silence, it was a small miracle that carried the weight of a century. The bus came before sunrise, its headlights cutting through the morning fog that clung to the holler. Betty stood at the end of the dirt road with Timmy's hand in hers, his small backpack hanging loosely from one strap. He'd never been this far from home before. The air smelled of diesel and wet soil. When the bus door opened, its steps seemed impossibly high, the metal cold against his fingers as he climbed aboard. Inside, the noise hit him first. Laughter, voices, the quick pulse of children who'd already learned where they belonged. He took a seat by the window, pressing close to the glass, staring at the blur of trees. Someone whispered his last name, then giggled. Another boy leaned over the aisle and asked where he lived. When Timmy answered quietly, truthfully, the boy blinked and said a word he didn't yet know was cruel. Asterisk inbred star. By the time he reached the school, the label had followed him off the bus. It wasn't shouted, not yet. It was murmured in hallways, scribbled on notebooks, carried home by children who repeated it at dinner tables where their parents didn't correct them. Timmy didn't understand what the word meant, only that it made Betty's face tighten when she heard it. She told him to keep his head down, to listen more than he spoke, and to remember that learning was something no one could take away. In class, Timmy sat near the back. His reading was slow, his speech careful, each word handled like something fragile. Teachers noticed how hard he tried. One of them, a patient woman with glasses and tired eyes, suggested extra help. Betty agreed, even though it meant longer bus rides and stares from other kids who called the special education room asterisk the slow class star. To Betty, labels didn't matter. Progress did. The world outside the Whitaker home was confusing to Timmy. Children spoke too fast, used words that didn't match their faces, but he learned the rhythm of it soon enough. He learned to read stop signs and food labels, to write his name neatly on lined paper. Sometimes he stumbled over his words, the syllables tangling, but he refused to stop trying. Every report card he brought home, creases worn from his pocket, Betty smoothed out and pinned to the wall beside his baby photo. At recess, he often sat alone, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. When others taunted him, he'd lower his head, silent, waiting for the noise to pass. Yet each morning he still boarded that bus. Each afternoon he came home with a new word written in his notebook, and Betty would make him say it out loud until it belonged to him. In a world quick to define him by his family's silence, Timmy was learning to speak for himself slowly, stubbornly, one word at a time. What began as survival was turning into something stronger, a quiet form of defiance, built not from pride, but from persistence. The Whitaker house had few decorations. The wallpaper had long since peeled away, leaving uneven boards the color of smoke. A single photograph hung crooked near the doorway, a faded image of Gracie Whitaker holding her brood of children decades earlier. But beside it, newer and brighter, hung something no one in that house had ever owned before, a high school diploma. The paper had yellowed slightly from the wood stove's heat, but the ink still read clear. Asterisk Timmy Whittaker, class of 1997 star. Betty had placed it there herself, tacking it high enough that dust and stray hands couldn't reach. Every morning when she passed it on her way to the kitchen, she'd glance at it and smile. He did it, she'd whisper under her breath. For a family that had lived generations without formal schooling, that piece of paper was more than an accomplishment. It was a quiet rebellion against everything that had defined them. The path to it hadn't been easy. Timmy's attendance record was a patchwork of interruptions. Weeks missed when snow made the roads impossible, or when someone at home fell ill, and he stayed behind to help. But year after year he returned. Teachers described him as gentle, soft-spoken, and endlessly patient. His grades were modest, but he never gave up. When he finally walked across the small gymnasium stage, wearing a borrowed gown that hung too large on his frame, the few relatives who came sat in silence, unsure how to show pride. Betty clapped softly, tears collecting in the corners of her eyes. Back home, she celebrated the only way she knew how, by making his favorite supper, fried potatoes and biscuits, and placing his graduation photo on the mantel beside a Bible missing its cover. The rest of the family gathered as they always did, not fully understanding what the diploma meant, only that Betty's joy filled the room with warmth. Ray barked once, a guttural sound that made Timmy laugh. Even Laureen, his mother, reached out and touched the photo, her eyes shining as if she recognized something sacred in it. That night, Timmy sat by the lamp, tracing his name on the certificate with a calloused finger. He could read it slowly. Every letter a mountain he had climbed on his own. Outside the cicadas buzzed, the dogs stirred, and the old house creaked, unchanged by his achievement, yet somehow lighter. In a family defined by silence and poverty, education had been a locked door. Timmy had found the key. The diploma didn't change their world. It didn't bring money or comfort or erase the whispers from town, but it gave them something they'd never had before, a symbol that progress, however small, was possible. In that tiny house in Odd, West Virginia, amid the hum of generators and the murmur of night, a single sheet of paper stood as proof that a life could bend away from its inheritance. Each time Betty looked at it, she didn't see ink or parchment. She saw hope. Thin, fragile, but alive, nailed to the wall of a house that had finally learned to dream. Mornings in Odd arrive quietly. The hills take their time waking, and the light drips slow across the porch where Timmy sits with a cup of instant coffee, the steam rising in thin ribbons that vanish before the trees catch it. The dogs lie at his feet, half asleep. Behind him, the house murmurs, Laureen shifting in her chair, Ray's low hum like an engine idling in another room. It is a rhythm he's learned by heart, one that hasn't changed in years. After high school, the world didn't expand for Timmy. It only settled. He stayed home because someone had to. His mother couldn't live alone, and Ray needed watching. The county check came once a month, enough to keep the lights flickering and the pantry stocked with cans. What the state called assistance, Timmy called survival. He didn't complain. It was just the life that waited for him, already mapped out before he could read the words on the forms he now filled out himself. Every few days he walked the mile to the crossroads store, a paper list folded in his pocket. There the clerk knew him by name and treated him kindly, one of the few people who did. "How's your memoir?" she'd ask, ringing up milk and bread. "Asterisk same as always asterisk," he'd answer. She'd nod, slip an extra candy bar in his bag, and tell him to take care. He always said, "Thank you." Small kindnesses, like small victories, counted more out here than anything grand. At home, he managed the routines Betty once ran. He handled the mail, kept track of appointments, and translated the world for those who couldn't navigate it. When the power company called about overdue bills, it was Timmy who spoke. When social workers stopped by, clipboard in hand, it was Timmy who answered the door. He'd interpret Ray's grunts into asterisk yes asterisk or asterisk no asterisk, Laureen's gestures into what she needed. To outsiders, he was a caretaker. To his family, he was the bridge that held their fragile life together. Evenings came early in Odd. The porch light flickered on before the sky went fully dark. Timmy would sit again in his spot, cigarette unlit between his fingers, listening to the distant hum of crickets. Sometimes a car passed, a rare event, and he'd watch the taillights fade until they disappeared beyond the trees. In those moments, he'd imagine where that road led. He'd think about the towns beyond the valley, places with movie theaters and diners, and wonder what it might feel like to walk into one without every eye turning to stare. He never said it aloud, but he knew his role wasn't freedom. It was duty. The diploma on the wall proved what he could do. The porch proved what he chose to do. He stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning the only people who ever needed him. In the stillness of those years, between the hum of insects and the low voices from inside, Timmy found a kind of peace. It wasn't the life others dreamed of, but it was steady, and it was his. The road to the Whitaker house had never seen headlights after dark, but one summer morning in 2020, a silver car crawled through the hollow, tires crunching on gravel. Behind the wheel was a man the family didn't know, carrying a camera, a tripod, and the quiet confidence of someone used to crossing thresholds. His name was Mark Laita, a photographer turned documentarian whose work had taken him from Los Angeles streets to Appalachian backroads. He had come looking for a family most people only whispered about. When the car stopped, the dogs arrived first, 5 of them barking until the hills echoed. From the porch, Ray barked back, a sound deep and startling, half challenge, half warning. The man didn't flinch. He waited, one hand raised in greeting. Camera slung low, his face calm, but cautious. Inside the doorway, Betty peered out, hand gripping the frame. She'd seen plenty of strangers turn up uninvited, usually to mock or take pictures they didn't deserve to take. But something in this man's stillness made her pause. Mark spoke gently, his words slow, clear. He wasn't there to exploit, he said. He just wanted to listen. Betty's eyes searched his for a long moment before she stepped onto the porch and motioned for him to sit. The dogs quieted, the door creaked open wider, and light spilled across faces that hadn't been seen by the world in decades. The first footage he captured felt like stepping into another century. The porch sagged under the family's weight, a mix of generations. Laureen, her hair white and her gaze fixed on something only she could see. Ray, restless and vocal, pacing between the railings, and Timmy, quieter, watching everything with wary curiosity. Betty did most of the talking, explaining who was who, filling in decades of silence with simple sentences. When Mark asked how they were all related, her answer was matter-of-fact. My mama and dad, they were double first cousins, she said. There was no shame in her tone, only truth. As the camera rolled, the world inside that small frame came alive. Timmy sitting beside his mother, occasionally offering a word when others couldn't. Ray barking toward the dogs, then smiling when they answered. Betty glancing between them, half proud, half protective. The camera didn't sensationalize them. It revealed the tenderness that existed in the quiet moments between gestures. When the video was uploaded weeks later, it exploded online. Millions watched, some horrified, some compassionate, most unable to look away. They saw what few had ever witnessed, a family shaped by isolation, by decisions long buried under generations of poverty and bloodline. But they also saw humanity, a sister's patience, a son's quiet awareness, a home still clinging to its own rhythm. For Timmy, it was the day the outside world finally found him. For decades, he had spoken only to people who already knew his silence. Now a lens had carried his voice farther than he could ever imagine. And the story of the Whitakers, once hidden at the end of a forgotten road, was no longer theirs alone. The Whitaker house had no computer, but word travels fast when the world decides to look your way. It began as a faint hum, neighbors mentioning a video, then distant relatives calling to ask if it was true. Within days, cars started appearing at the edge of the dirt road, headlights cutting through the same fog that once hid the family from view. Inside, Timmy sat at the table, unaware that his face was now on millions of screens. Betty was the first to understand. A neighbor's grandson showed her the video on his phone, Mark's footage, the porch, the dogs, Ray barking in reply. She watched in silence, her reflection caught faintly in the cracked glass. When the clip ended, she didn't say a word, just handed the phone back and stared toward the hills. They're going to know us now, she murmured. The video spread like wildfire. Viewers from around the world watched in disbelief. Some heartbroken, others cruelly amused. Comment sections filled with sympathy, shock, and mockery all tangled together. People wrote that the family should be helped, studied, or left alone. For every kind word, there was another that cut deep. The internet had turned their life, once silent, unseen, into a global spectacle. At first, the attention brought something rare. Help. Donations poured in from strangers moved by what they'd seen. Mark Laita set up a fund, promising that every dollar would go toward improving their home, their health, their dignity. Packages began arriving at the local post office, clothes, blankets, boxes of food. The family, who had spent years surviving on so little, suddenly had more than they could carry. Betty thanked everyone through Mark's updates, her gratitude soft but sincere. For a moment it seemed the exposure had done what poverty and isolation never could. It had opened a door. But then came the visitors. Curiosity grew faster than compassion. Tourists drove hours to find the house from the video, parking at the edge of the property to stare, to film, to confirm that the rumors were real. They came at all hours. Sometimes families with cameras, sometimes teenagers daring each other to knock on the door. When Betty or Timmy stepped outside, the lenses followed. The Whitakers had become both a charity and a sideshow. Timmy didn't understand why people wanted his picture. He greeted them politely, the way Betty had taught him, but when they laughed or whispered, he'd retreat to the porch and sit until they left. To him, they weren't visitors. They were reminders that the quiet world he'd known was gone. By autumn, the narrow road through Odd was busier than it had ever been. The mailbox filled with letters, some kind, others strange. The porch sagged under the weight of gifts and cameras. For decades, the family had been invisible. Now they were trapped beneath the bright, unblinking gaze of a world that had mistaken fascination for understanding. What had begun as empathy was already turning into spectacle, and for the Whitakers, fame would prove just as heavy as silence. The news spread fast and quietly. Larry Whitaker was dead. The message came through a phone call carried by the same network of relatives and neighbors that once shared casseroles and condolences. Mark Laita heard it late one evening, sitting among hard drives and editing notes for another soft white underbelly segment. Larry, they said, had suffered a sudden heart attack. The family needed help with funeral costs. Mark didn't question it at first. Over the past year, he'd grown close to the Whitakers, documenting their fragile existence with care. He'd seen their poverty, their isolation, and the weight they carried. So when the request for help arrived, he did what he'd always done. He gave. He shared the news online, posted a tribute, and helped raise money for burial expenses. Donations poured in, strangers offering comfort and cash to ease the family's latest tragedy. But something felt off. Days passed, and no one could confirm where Larry had been buried. No obituary appeared in the local paper. When Mark asked gently for details, messages grew inconsistent, different voices giving different versions. The tone shifted from grief to evasion. Then came the breaking point. A new video clip surfaced, filmed not by Mark, but by someone else. In it, Larry sat alive on the very porch where he had supposedly drawn his last breath. At first, Mark thought it was old footage, but the date stamp was recent. Too recent. Larry was alive. The death had been fabricated. The truth emerged slowly and painfully. Larry's daughter, known locally as BJ, confessed to inventing the story. She told Mark her father had passed in order to secure more donations, claiming she needed funds to cover funeral expenses. She said she was desperate, that addiction had clouded her judgment. Her apology was real enough, but the damage was already done. For Mark, who had spent years trying to treat the Whitakers with dignity, the revelation cut deep. His project, once built on empathy and trust, was suddenly shadowed by deceit. He wasn't angry at the family's disabled core, Timmy, Laureen, Ray, but at the chain of opportunists orbiting them. They had turned a story about humanity into an opportunity for profit. He stepped away for a time. The visits stopped. Donations were frozen. Comment sections filled with arguments, some defending the family, others accusing them all of fraud. Online sympathy turned to suspicion, and the fragile bridge between the Whitakers and the outside world cracked. Months later, Mark would return to Odd cautiously, camera in hand. When he stepped onto the porch again, Larry was waiting. "I'm sorry," Larry said, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what they done." He extended his hand, and Mark shook it. The moment was awkward, tender, and heavy with unspoken forgiveness. The camera didn't capture betrayal that day. It captured the cost of it. In a world that had finally learned the Whitakers' names, trust had become their most fragile possession, and even that, for a time, had nearly died. The chair she always sat in was still there, tilted slightly toward the window, cushion worn flat, a quilt draped neatly over the back. Dust had already begun to gather on its arms, as if the house itself refused to believe she wasn't coming back. For decades, Betty had been the pulse of the Whitaker home. The one who managed the food, the bills, the medications, the visits from people who spoke too quickly and left too soon. Without her, the rhythm faltered. In the first weeks after her death, the house seemed to drift. Timmy moved through the rooms in silence, doing the chores as best he could, boiling water for coffee, feeding the dogs, sweeping the porch. Laureen sat in her chair by the window, humming without pattern, waiting for someone who no longer came. Ray wandered restlessly, his barks sharper, louder, as if calling her name in the only language he knew. No one corrected him. No one could. Neighbors noticed first. The mail piled up. Trash went unburned behind the shed. The smell of damp and decay began to spread across the yard. People who'd long avoided the property now slowed their cars when they passed, their curiosity tempered by worry. One neighbor, an older woman who'd known Betty since childhood, brought soup and found the door unlocked, the lights dim. Timmy met her at the threshold, polite but confused. "She's gone," he said simply, and stepped aside so the woman could see the empty chair. After that, calls were made to the county, to social services, to anyone who might know what to do. Officials arrived in plain clothes, their kindness professional, their notes precise. They spoke softly to Timmy, carefully to Laureen, and gently guided Ray away from the door. It didn't take long for them to see what Betty had hidden through sheer determination. Without her, the home couldn't sustain itself. They came back days later with forms, evaluations, and quiet decisions. Timmy tried to understand, nodding at every explanation, though he knew the outcome before they said it aloud. The state would intervene. For their safety, they'd be moved somewhere with food, electricity, supervision. The family who had lived in one place for generations would finally leave it, not by choice, but by necessity. When the van arrived, Timmy packed what he thought mattered. A few clothes, a worn photograph of Betty, and the framed diploma from the wall. He left everything else, the cracked dishes, the dogs, the chair by the window. As he closed the door behind him, the latch caught, sticking the way it always had. The house stood quiet after they were gone, its windows reflecting only trees and sky. To outsiders, the state's action looked like mercy. But to the Whitakers, it was exile from the only space where they'd ever known how to exist. Betty's chair remained by the window, untouched. In that stillness, you could almost hear the echo of her voice, steady and certain, keeping a fragile world in order. Without her, the silence felt final. In the last known footage of Timmy Whittaker, his face is half-lit by the pale glow of afternoon light. His expression is calm but tired, the kind of weariness that doesn't come from age alone, but from generations pressing down through blood and circumstance. It's a face that carries more than its own story. Behind the stillness are the choices, accidents, and silences of a century. To the unkind eye, Timmy became a meme, a headline, a curiosity. But his life, quiet, stunted, yet enduring, reveals what inbreeding actually looks like when stripped of myth. It's not horror, it's attrition. When cousins marry cousins for generations, the math of genetics closes in. Each repetition narrows the odds, doubling the chance that recessive traits, once rare and dormant, surface together. The result is not monstrosity, but fragility. Limited speech, impaired coordination, minds that stall mid-thought, bodies that age faster than they should. Science can map it neatly, but standing before Timmy, the outcome feels less clinical than tragic. Yet biology alone doesn't explain odd, West Virginia. The Whitakers are not the first or only family shaped by inbreeding. They are what happens when poverty meets isolation long enough for the two to merge. Geography boxed them in. Lack of education kept them there. Over time, the town stopped intervening and the family's world shrank to the width of their own bloodline. In places like odd, choice often means the absence of any other path. To call this story genetic is only half right. It's also social neglect in its purest form. When entire regions become invisible to the rest of the country, while cities advanced, mountain hollers like this one were left behind, stripped of industry, schools, and doctors. The same systems that ignored them later mocked them. When the internet finally saw the Whitakers, it saw only the surface: barking, confusion, dirt. Few paused to ask how a family like this could exist generation after generation without help or guidance. Timmy's life proves something uncomfortable. That inbreeding isn't born from depravity, but from abandonment. Families don't collapse inward because they want to. They do so because there's nowhere else left to go. The real deformity isn't in their genes. It's in the apathy that allowed them to vanish from society until a camera stumbled upon them. And yet within that closed loop, Timmy found a kind of integrity. He stayed, cared for those who could not care for themselves, and never once blamed the world that had already judged him. His life, simple as it seems, refutes the cruelty with which outsiders labeled him. He is not proof of moral decay, but of human endurance. The body enduring its own blueprint, the heart surviving everything else. If the Whittaker story holds a lesson, it's this. What the world calls asterisk inbred asterisk is often just asterisk unseen star. Genetics wrote their limits, but neglect sealed their fate. And in the middle of that equation sits Timmy, one man bearing the quiet cost of generations that no one came to save. Evening comes slow and odd, the kind that turns every ridge into shadow before the stars dare to appear. The Whitaker porch, once cluttered with chairs and the hum of voices, is quiet now. The dogs sleep near the steps. The boards creak under Timmy's weight as he settles into the same spot he's occupied for decades. His place between the world and the woods. The light fades unevenly, brushing half his face in gold and leaving the other half in blue. He doesn't speak. He never needs to. The quiet is its own language, one he's known longer than words. His eyes track the fading tree line where the day dissolves into night. Somewhere below, a car engine echoes faintly along the road that leads out of Odd, the road most people take only once. The sound fades quickly, as if even the world beyond has learned not to linger here. The house behind him is still, its rooms emptied of the familiar patterns, its windows holding the memory of those who once filled them. Betty's chair remains by the window, untouched. Laureen's blanket is folded neatly across the couch. Ray's old walking stick leans against the door frame. Time has thinned this home, but not erased it. For Timmy, these objects are coordinates in a life lived small but steady. A map of devotion drawn in chores, gestures, and long silences. When Mark Laita's camera last captured him, Timmy was sitting much like this, staring toward the horizon. Millions of people would later pause the video there, studying his face, trying to interpret it, pity, confusion, peace. But what they were really seeing was something simpler, a man who had endured. Behind the lines on his forehead is the quiet endurance of someone who bore the weight of generations without resentment, without demand. There's no grand ending here, no redemption arc, no transformation. The house is still poor. The land is still isolated. But the world now knows the name Timmy Whittaker. And with it a sliver of understanding about what it costs to be forgotten. The internet called him asterisk the most inbred man in America asterisk, but in truth he was something rarer. Proof that even in the most damaged soil, there can still be tenderness. The dusk deepens. A breeze moves through the trees carrying the smell of rain and wood smoke. Timmy leans forward, elbows on his knees, the diploma still hanging somewhere inside, a quiet reminder that he once reached beyond what anyone expected. The hills darken, folding over each other like old memories. For a moment he hums softly the way his mother used to, and the sound drifts into the air, carried upward until it's indistinguishable from the wind. The camera would linger here, not on the poverty or the legend, but on the man himself, one silhouette against the endless green of Appalachia. He didn't choose his bloodline. He simply carried it with more grace than the world ever gave him credit for. And as the night finally settles, you can almost hear the question the silence leaves behind. Asterisk when the world forgets people like Timmy, what part of ourselves do we lose with them? Asterisk.